Here, we're going to explore a part of the history of art. What you're watching right now is one of the most expensive paintings ever. In its last appraisal, done around 15 years ago in 2011 by Christie's, its estimated value was about $250 million. This is Mural on Indian Red Ground by Jackson Pollock. At first glance, it may look like nothing more than random and repeated splashes of paint. But what happened that a work, which in its own time was compared to a plate of spaghetti thrown at the wall, ended up gaining such a position in art history? If that question interests you, stay with us in this episode. When we talk about modern art, we usually have to go to Paris. From the late 19th century onwards, this city was the capital of visual arts in the world. Most of the prominent artists were in Paris, and major events in the visual arts happened there. But with the beginning of World War II, this started to change. Obviously, one of the reasons was the rise of fascism and the occupation of Paris by Nazi Germany. When the Nazis took Paris, they also started restricting artistic activities. Many well-known artists who were living in France at the time, like Picasso and Duchamp, had their art labeled as degenerate by the Nazis, and their activity was limited. In these circumstances, artists divided into two groups. Some, like Picasso and Leger, stayed in Paris and continued working under constraints. The others, hoping to live and work freely, chose to emigrate. Where to? To the U.S. there was an American journalist named Varian Fry, who, in collaboration with the Emergency Rescue Committee, created a network to help artists, writers, and intellectuals whose escape from France wasn't easy. Using emergency visas, fake passports, and secret routes, he helped over 2,000 people escape fascist-occupied France. Among the artists who went to America were the Jewish painter Marc Chagall, Marcel Duchamp, and surrealists like Max Ernst and André Breton. These artists didn't just escape. They brought with them the artistic movements that had been flourishing in Paris. So we're witnessing a kind of collective migration in which artistic and cultural movements were being transferred from the origin society to the destination one. When these refugee artists arrived in New York, they got to work. Workshops, galleries, and new art schools began to form. For the first time, American artists had the chance to get acquainted with concepts like surrealism, cubism, and modern art up close. In fact, World War II didn't just change country borders. It also significantly redirected the path of art history. By the 1950s, New York was becoming the new capital of modern art, and one of the first truly American styles, actually the very first, was beginning to hatch in a small studio about 100 miles from New York City. This studio belonged to a couple of painters, Lee Krasner and Jackson Pollock, the main characters of today's story. Jackson Pollock was born on January 28, 1912, in the state of Wyoming, USA. He was the fifth and youngest child in the family, with 4 older brothers. His father, who was at times a farmer and later worked in land surveying, had no steady job, so the family kept moving from state to state. These frequent relocations stripped the children of any sense of stability. Pollock spent most of his childhood in Arizona and California. His mother was a strong, ambitious, and somewhat domineering woman who did weaving and sewing. Because of her interest in handicrafts, she had a good relationship with art in general, and this encouraged her to support her children's artistic interests. Jackson's father was a quiet man who, when Jackson was a teenager, became increasingly distant due to work and eventually had to live apart. This separation was emotionally damaging to young Jackson and may have been a source of his later feelings of abandonment, anxiety, and inner rage. Pollock's school years were not particularly positive. He was unruly and defiant, and of course was repeatedly expelled. He had a restless personality, could be aggressive, and had serious trouble concentrating, which made it hard for him to stay in traditional classes. Eventually, he abandoned formal education to focus entirely on his passion. That passion? Painting. An interest likely inspired by his older brother Charles, who was also a painter. Charles probably introduced him to art at an early age. But Pollock's serious artistic journey began around the age of 16 or 17. In 1928, he enrolled in an art school in Los Angeles where he received formal training. However, he was expelled from that school too. 2 years later, at age 18, he decided to move to New York to be closer to the modern art scene. That marked the beginning of his professional journey. In New York, he studied under Thomas Hart Benton, a painter of American realism. Benton's work often focused on the American working class and was very different from Pollock's in style and technique. The only elements Pollock seems to have taken from Benton were the vibrant, high-contrast colors and the ability to control a large canvas. Also, like Benton's paintings, Pollock's works often lack a fixed center, which causes the viewer's gaze to constantly move around the canvas, a feature typical of Pollock's art. Pollock's early works were influenced by the Surrealist movement. Now, he was in New York. What kind of New York? The New York of the late 1930s and early 1940s that we talked about at the beginning of the episode. A New York that had become a refuge for artists fleeing World War II. A significant group among these refugees were Surrealists whose art had been labeled degenerate by the Nazis. People like Duchamp, André Breton, who wrote the Surrealist Manifesto, Max Ernst, and many others were now introducing and spreading Surrealist thinking in American art. Pollock was deeply influenced by Surrealism. So what is Surrealism? Surrealism means beyond reality. It was a movement in art and literature that was heavily based on the theories of Sigmund Freud, the influential psychoanalyst who is considered the father of psychoanalysis. Freud believed that the human mind is divided into two parts, the conscious mind, which includes memories and experiences we can recall, and the unconscious mind, which consists of things that have been repressed and are no longer accessible to us. The unconscious mind is made up of fears, childhood memories, traumas, and suppressed desires. Even though we may not consciously recall them, they still influence our behavior. Freud believed that what we know about ourselves is like the tip of an iceberg. Only a small part is visible above water. The more important part, the one that actually shapes our behavior, is hidden beneath the surface and is not easily accessible, even to ourselves. But if we could access it, we might understand ourselves better and maybe even solve some of our problems. Freud said that, for example, our dreams or slips of the tongue are actually gateways to the unconscious. Through the analysis of dreams, he tried to access his patients' unconscious to resolve their traumas. This was a very brief and simple explanation of the unconscious. Now, what did Surrealist artists do? One of the goals of Surrealist artists was to gain access to the unconscious. Each one might have had a different approach. For instance, in Surrealist literature, there was a technique called automatic writing. This method involves putting your pen on paper and starting to write without thinking or planning. You shouldn't stop writing, even if you see that your sentences are losing their logical or narrative coherence. You write continuously without editing. Surrealists believed that in this technique, unconscious thoughts are expressed in their fluid state without the intervention of reason. Eventually, the result might be sentences and images that follow each other without logical connections, something similar to what we see in dreams. Now, how did this method manifest in painting? In Surrealist painting, there were two groups. One group, like Salvador Dali, created works that juxtaposed unrelated elements to depict a dreamlike, surreal, or even chaotic world. The second group, inspired by automatic writing, practiced automatic painting. That is, they held the brush and began to paint whatever came to their mind in the moment, without needing a preliminary plan. The result was something like Jackson Pollock's work, who was influenced by this second group of Surrealist painters. What he took from Surrealism was seeing art as a process of the unconscious and freedom, not as a reflection of the outside world. Now, why did Pollock get involved with the Surrealists? In the early 1930s, Pollock faced serious mental health issues, including depression, anxiety, and intense anger, and his health deteriorated to the point where he had to seek medical help. Pollock had started excessive drinking in his teenage years, which added to his mental health issues. Between 1938 and 1941, Pollock underwent psychotherapy that used Jungian techniques. Carl Gustav Jung was a famous psychoanalyst on par with Freud, but some of his theories differed from Freud's. The most important difference was that Freud believed in the personal unconscious, while Jung believed in not only the personal unconscious, but also a collective unconscious, where we share unconscious memories and experiences. While Freud's therapeutic methods focused on making the individual aware of their suppressed desires to resolve internal conflicts and reduce anxiety, Jung's methods considered the individuation process, helping the person discover all aspects of their personality. Jung's treatment wasn't just about solving problems, but about psychological growth. One of his methods was working with symbols, myths, and archetypes. Pollock, who had become familiar with Jungian therapy, looked at art as a tool for expressing the collective unconscious. In his surrealist works, he sought to represent deep, mythic human emotions, not the appearance of the external world, without knowing exactly what the outcome of his painting would be. Sometimes, he didn't even use a brush, but directly painted on the canvas with tubes of paint. During this period, Pollock met two influential women in his life, Peggy Guggenheim and Krasner. Let's take a look at who they were. First, Peggy Guggenheim. She was a New York woman from an extremely wealthy family. When she was a teenager, her father, a passenger on the Titanic, tragically passed away, leaving her with a vast inheritance. Peggy was deeply passionate about modern art. She wasn't an artist herself, but loved artists, and became one of the most significant patrons of avant-garde artists in the 1940s. This reminds us of the Medici family in the Renaissance period. Peggy Guggenheim not only bought works from artists, but also provided direct financial support to many so they could focus on their art. She also married Max Ernst, a surrealist artist. One of her significant achievements was founding the Art of This Century Gallery in New York, which became a center for modern American artists. It was there that many pioneering artists, including Jackson Pollock, were introduced to the art community. Around 1943, Pollock, a struggling and anonymous artist with personal and financial problems and alcohol addiction, was introduced to Guggenheim by Marcel Duchamp, who was Peggy's personal advisor. That year, she signed a lucrative contract with Pollock. As part of the deal, Guggenheim would provide Pollock with a fixed monthly salary, and in return, everything Pollock painted throughout the year would belong to her. Guggenheim held a solo exhibition of Pollock's paintings, which had a significant impact on his career. Now, let's talk about the next woman, Krasner. Their relationship began in 1942 when they both participated in a group exhibition. At the time, Krasner was a bit more well-known than Pollock. She became so impressed by Pollock's unique work in the exhibition that she visited his apartment to meet him. Their relationship began then. 3 years later, they married in a church with 2 witnesses, even though Pollock was still struggling with his alcohol addiction at that time. After their marriage, Krasner created a situation where Pollock could distance himself from New York and the people who constantly encouraged him to drink. With financial help from Peggy Guggenheim, they bought a cottage with a studio 100 miles away from New York on Long Island. The studio became Pollock's painting workshop, and one of his most productive and brilliant periods began. Art dealer John Bernard Myers once said that without Lee, there would have never been a Jackson Pollock. And artist Belfman stated that Krasner was like Frankenstein for Pollock, someone who patiently and kindly helped piece together Pollock's fragmented and chaotic works. Krasner was Pollock's greatest supporter. In both the best and worst times of their lives, she constantly told him he was a great artist. She told him he was number one. She essentially became his manager. Krasner handled the gallery connections and collector relations. We may know Lee Krasner today as the wife of America's most famous painter, but at the time, she was actually the partner of a man who had serious alcohol problems, probably bipolar disorder, and whose moods fluctuated between depression and impulsive behaviors. She was disorganized, carefree, and aggressive, and they were very poor in the early years of their relationship. But Lee stood by Pollock like a mother with love and faith. A character like Picasso didn't need someone to present himself or to know about contemporary art movements. But an artist like Pollock could hardly have survived without Lee. In addition to everything, Krasner kept Pollock updated on modern art developments and also played the role of a teacher for him. It seems that all these responsibilities left her with less time for her own painting, and Pollock actually created many of his masterpieces after meeting Lee. Mural, one of Jackson Pollock's most famous works, was one of the first commissions Peggy Guggenheim gave him. She had asked him to paint a mural for her, but Marcel Duchamp suggested it should be on a canvas so it could be moved. So, a large canvas measuring approximately 2.5 by 6 meters was provided for Pollock. Peggy gave him full freedom to paint whatever he wanted, only setting a deadline. Lee Krasner recounts that for a long time, Pollock would just stare at the blank canvas without touching the paint. She says he was overwhelmed by the scale and responsibility of the work. But just a few days before the deadline, Pollock, without any preliminary sketches, suddenly began working and completed the massive canvas in a burst of emotional energy. Later, experts questioned this story by analyzing the paint's drying patterns, suggesting that the work probably wasn't completed in a single night. Pollock himself said the painting was inspired by a scene of a herd of wild cattle running. There's no image of a cow in the mural, but you can feel the movement and eruption of a boundless, living force. This spontaneous outburst eventually evolved into a style that was on its way to becoming the first truly American art movement, the style we now associate with Jackson Pollock, Abstract Expressionism. Pollock became drawn to working on large canvases and got used to laying the canvas on the ground while painting. He said, "It was as if I could enter my painting. I felt closer to my work. When the canvas is upright, you can only view it from one direction. But when it's on the ground, you can walk around it and see it from all angles." Over time, Pollock realized that when he dripped or splattered paint from a relative height, it would create the forms he envisioned. So he began to repeat this technique. From around 1947 onward, this method, known as drip painting, became Pollock's signature technique. He would spread the canvas on the floor, sometimes using rolls of raw canvas, then use brushes, sticks, knives, or even punctured paint cans to drip pour or fling the paint. Pollock moved around the canvas, twisted, bent, and ran as if in a duet dance with his artwork. Instead of direct brush contact, he allowed the movement of his body and the force of gravity to guide the paint. The final result was not as important as the process of creation. It was as though the painter wanted both himself and his painting to be part of a living process, not just the construction of a static image. This method led to a revolution in art history. Pollock became one of the founders of Abstract Expressionism, which became the first major post-World War II art movement and turned New York into the center of the visual art world. Here, it's worth understanding what Expressionism and Abstract Expressionism are. So far, we've had a brief look at Pollock's artistic journey and the path he took to create the works he is now famous for. But if we want a short and simple answer to the question, what was Pollock's style? The best answer is Abstract Expressionism. The term combines two words, expressionism, which refers to emotional intensity, and abstract, meaning non-representational or non-figurative. Expressionism was a European movement that developed between the two world wars, where artists used exaggeration, distortion, and emotional release to express their inner feelings. These artists were influenced by figures like Van Gogh and Munch. On the other hand, abstract art focuses on indirect representation of reality. If we consider painting as a spectrum of visual representation, on one end we have naturalistic painting, where objects look like what they are, often figurative, and on the other end, abstract painting, where figurative elements are minimized or entirely eliminated. Simply put, in abstract painting, we see pure forms and colors. We can't identify natural elements. We can't say this is a tree, this is a person, or this is a forest. It's a modern style known globally through artists like Kandinsky. Abstract Expressionism, which blends these two movements, is generally used to refer to the style that emerged in the U.S. after World War II. It was the first wholly American art movement and includes works by artists like Pollock, de Kooning, Rothko, and others. Abstract Expressionism is painting without preconceived design, even without regular geometric forms, executed in a spontaneous and free-flowing manner, capturing the artist's momentary emotions. Let's move to the next term, action painting. The American critic Harold Rosenberg said that among abstract expressionist artists, some worked methodically, while others, like Pollock, created art by dripping and flinging paint onto the canvas. Rosenberg called Pollock's style action painting. In action painting, the process of creation is more important than the final result, and the work is often created through physical gestures and partly through chance. However, Pollock insisted that none of his works relied on randomness. He said, "Every drop of paint in my paintings is exactly where I want it to be." The next term is drip painting, which is not a style but a technique, meaning dripping or splashing paint, the very method Pollock used to create his abstract expressionist works. To summarize, Jackson Pollock was a painter in the abstract expressionist style, where he expressed his emotions and subconscious through freeform gestures. The technique he used is called drip painting. 2 years after Pollock introduced this new method, in August 1949, Life magazine decided to interview him. This interview marked a turning point in Pollock's career for several reasons. First, it was his introduction to the wider American public. Before that, Pollock was mainly known in the niche Avant-Garde art circle of New York, but with this feature in a high-circulation family magazine like Life, Pollock was about to reach a new level of fame. The next notable thing was the article's headline, "Jackson Pollock, is he the greatest living painter in the United States?" This question alone was enough to anchor that title to Pollock, boost the value of his works, and catapult his career. The idea, arrangement, and coordination of the interview came from Lee Krasner. Despite Pollock's initial doubts, she convinced him it could be a major opportunity. However, her role in the article was portrayed as marginal, only referred to as Mrs. Pollock rather than an independent artist, influential woman, or even his manager. He appeared in the background of a few photos. At this point, Pollock was at the peak of his fame. He had earned the title of the greatest living American painter. All the modern art galleries were eager to purchase his work. And yet he was not well. All this success seemed to bring him more anxiety than joy. As always, he turned to his longtime companion, alcohol, to escape the pressure and stress. Throughout the years, it was Krasner who helped Pollock maintain even a minimal level of stability and kept him from drowning in alcohol. She was like a friend, a lover, a mother. You couldn't really put a single label on it. She was constantly pulling him out of addiction and mental breakdowns. Taking care of Pollock, dealing with him, managing his art career, it was a full-time job. That's why Krasner never even considered having children. To keep Pollock away from alcohol, they constantly had to argue. These arguments began to put a strain on their relationship. Then, in 1956, 44-year-old Pollock met a young 26-year-old woman at a gallery, Ruth Kligman. Kligman was an art student herself, painting abstract works. Naturally, being in a relationship with the most famous living American painter was very exciting for her. That same year, Krasner found out about Pollock's affair and was deeply hurt. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was witnessing Pollock's uncontrolled return to alcohol, leading to destructive behavior. Rash decisions, aggressive outbursts, self-destruction. All the things Krasner had fought against for years, now her husband had chosen to embrace while spending his days with a younger woman who didn't impose any boundaries on him. Krasner felt exhausted. She needed to rest, to gather strength to pull Pollock out of his self-made swamp once again. So, she decided to take a trip to Europe. It wasn't abandoning Pollock. It was an emotional escape, a temporary withdrawal so she could rebuild herself. Meanwhile, Pollock and Kligman's relationship intensified. For a time, Pollock even brought Kligman to the home he shared with Krasner. Now let's go to August 12, 1956. Krasner's phone rang. It was a call from New York. Your husband has died in a car accident. At first, Lee Krasner thought it was a cruel joke. But when she heard the details, she realized, painful as it was, it all made sense. The day before, Pollock had been drinking heavily all day. Then he got into a car with his girlfriend, Ruth Kligman, and her friend. Drunk, he drove recklessly. Kligman's friend cried and begged him to let her out of the car, but Pollock was too intoxicated. The car crashed into a tree. In the accident, Jackson Pollock and Kligman's friend died instantly. Kligman survived. Later, she wrote a book about her relationship with Pollock. She wrote, "Everything changed in a moment. The sound of shattering glass, the sensation of being thrown, and then darkness. When I regained consciousness, I felt pain all over my body and heard the sirens of the ambulance. I couldn't believe Jack was gone." After that, Ruth Kligman had a brief relationship with William de Kooning, Pollock's friend and artistic rival. But Lee Krasner, upon hearing of the tragedy, returned to New York. She had not only lost the man she had fought for, supported, and saved for years, but he had died while being with his mistress. Years later, Krasner said in an interview, "When I returned to that house, it was full of sorrow, but I stayed because a part of me was within those walls." Krasner organized the funeral, preserved Pollock's works and legacy, and for decades worked tirelessly to establish his name as a pillar of American art without ever highlighting her own role in making that happen. She also continued painting professionally. When she passed away in 1984 at the age of 75, the Museum of Modern Art in New York held a retrospective of her work. The New York Times wrote that the exhibition clearly defined Krasner's place in the New York school. After her death, the home she shared with Pollock was turned into the Pollock-Krasner House and Studio and opened to the public. She also established the Pollock-Krasner Foundation in 1985, according to her will, to financially support talented but struggling artists, just as Peggy Guggenheim once had done for her and her husband. Lee Krasner was buried next to Pollock. Today, they both rest in Green River Cemetery in New York. A large stone marks Pollock's grave, and a smaller one symbolizes the final resting place of Lee Krasner.